Hello, you're listening to Seraphim. Today's episode is a new original story about karma, unexpected kindness, and truths that refuse to stay hidden. A billionaire stood in a Houston courtroom, his Italian suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling at his sides. On the screen behind the judge played a dashcam video that 200 million people had already watched. In it, a grown man in a Mercedes hurled a water bottle into the face of a 7-year-old boy. But the video was not why the billionaire's hands were shaking. His hands were shaking because 30 minutes ago, a lawyer had placed a single sheet of paper before him, a DNA test result, and the words printed on that paper had burned a hole through 20 years of silence. The little boy he had struck, the child he had screamed at like a dog in the street, was his own nephew. His dead brother's only son, the sole living heir to the Whitmore family fortune, a fortune worth $460 million. And every person in that courtroom, every camera, every microphone was about to find out exactly what kind of man Richard Whitmore really was. But let me start from the beginning, because this story did not begin in a courtroom. It began on a street corner in Houston, Texas, under a July sun so hot that the asphalt shimmered like water, and a little boy named Elijah stood at the edge of a busy intersection with a cooler full of bottled water and a heart full of love for the only family he had left. Elijah Carter was 7 years old. He was small for his age, with skinny arms and knees that always seemed to have a fresh scrape on them. His skin was the color of dark honey, and his eyes were large and round and carried a kind of seriousness that did not belong on a child's face. He wore the same pair of sneakers every day, white once, now gray with dirt and wear, and a t-shirt that was a size too big because his grandmother bought clothes he could grow into, not clothes that fit. Every morning before the sun climbed too high, Elijah would fill his red cooler with ice and water bottles he and his grandmother bought in bulk from the discount store on Wheeler Avenue. 24 bottles for $3.78. He sold each one for $1. On a good day, he made $15 or $16. On a bad day, when the heat broke and people rolled up their windows, he made $5 or $6. Either way, every single dollar went into his grandmother's coffee can on top of the refrigerator. The can with the faded label that read Maxwell House, but held nothing but crumpled bills and the quiet prayers of a blind woman trying to keep a roof over their heads. His grandmother's name was Ruth Carter. She was 68 years old, and she had been blind for the last 3 of those years. Ever since the diabetes took her sight the way a thief takes jewelry, slowly at first and then all at once. Ruth had raised Elijah since he was 11 months old, since the night her daughter Grace collapsed on the kitchen floor and never got back up. An aneurysm, the doctors said. Quick and painless, they said, as if that was supposed to make it better, as if a baby was not supposed to grow up without a mother, as if a grandmother was not supposed to bury her only child and then figure out how to raise a grandchild on a fixed income with failing health and fading eyes. But Ruth Carter did not complain. Ruth Carter was not built for complaining. She was built for enduring. She was built for praying. She was built for loving that boy with every ounce of strength her tired body could muster, and so that is exactly what she did. Their apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building on Cullen Boulevard that smelled like mildew and cooking oil. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the faucet dripped no matter how hard you twisted it shut. The rent was $850 a month, and Ruth's Social Security check was $912. That left $62 for everything else: food, medicine, bus fare, soap, toilet paper, school supplies. $62 stretched across 30 days like a rubber band about to snap. Elijah understood this. He understood it the way children in poverty understand things they should never have to understand, not because someone sat them down and explained it, but because they watched. They watched their grandmother count coins on the kitchen table. They watched her choose between filling a prescription and filling the refrigerator. They watched her hands shake when she opened the mailbox, because every envelope was a bill, and every bill was a threat. Elijah watched all of this, and one day in May, 2 months before this story's terrible and beautiful turning point, he walked up to the intersection of Scott Street and Wheeler Avenue and started selling water. He had seen the older boys do it. teenagers with loud voices and quick feet who darted between cars like fish in a stream. Elijah was not loud, and he was not quick, but he was polite. He would walk up to a car window with a bottle in each hand, hold them up so the driver could see the cold sweat on the plastic, and say, "Water, sir?" or "Water, ma'am?" in a voice so gentle and earnest that most people could not say no. Some drivers gave him the dollar, some gave him two. A few told him to keep the change from a 5. And one woman, a teacher from the elementary school on the next block, gave him a $10 bill every Friday and never took a single bottle. She just said, "You keep working hard, baby," and drove away with her window still down. And Elijah would stand there watching her car disappear and feeling something warm spread through his chest that he did not have a name for yet, but that grown folks call grace. Every evening, after the sun dipped low enough that the shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, Elijah would drag his cooler back home, count his money on the kitchen table, and place it in the coffee can. Ruth would sit across from him, her clouded eyes pointed somewhere above his head, and listen to the sound of crumpled bills being smoothed and stacked. She always asked the same question, "How much today, baby?" And Elijah always answered the same way, giving her the number and then adding, "We're going to be okay, Grandma." It was a phrase he had learned from her. She had said it to him 1,000 times, after the lights got cut off, after the landlord banged on the door, after the grocery cart had more items put back than kept. "We're going to be okay, baby." And now he said it back to her, like a song passed down, like a hymn sung in a church where the pews were wobbly and the choir was small, but the faith was enormous. Ruth would smile when he said it. A slow, full smile that crinkled the skin around her useless eyes and showed the gap where her left canine tooth used to be. She would reach across the table and find his hand, always finding it on the first try, as if blindness had given her other senses a kind of supernatural aim. And she would squeeze it and say, "Yes, we are, baby. Yes, we are." And in that moment, in that kitchen that smelled like dish soap and beans, with the faucet dripping its steady rhythm and the ceiling fan clicking on every third rotation, there was more love in that apartment than in mansions 10 times its size. There was more wealth in that coffee can than in bank accounts with 7 zeros. Because love, real love, the kind that gets up at 5 in the morning and sells water in 100-degree heat so your blind grandmother can keep her home, that love is a currency no stock market can measure and no billionaire can buy. But this story is also about a billionaire, and his name was Richard Whitmore. Richard Whitmore was 54 years old, and he was the kind of rich that most people cannot even imagine. Not millionaire rich, not nice house and a boat rich. Richard Whitmore was $460 million rich. The kind of rich where you stop counting because counting is for people who might run out. He was the CEO of Whitmore Capital Partners, a private equity firm that bought struggling companies, stripped them down, sold off the parts, and pocketed the difference. Some people called this smart business. Other people called it vulture capitalism. Richard did not care what anyone called it. Richard cared about numbers, and his numbers were very, very large. He lived at a 12,000-square-foot house in River Oaks, the wealthiest neighborhood in Houston, a neighborhood where the lawns were greener than nature intended, and the fences were tall enough to keep out everything except the smell of old money. His house had 7 bedrooms, an indoor pool, a wine cellar with over 2,000 bottles, and a garage that held a Bentley, a Porsche, 2 Mercedes, and a vintage Aston Martin that he drove once a year on his birthday. He had been married twice. His first wife left him after 4 years because, as she told her friends at brunch, living with Richard was like living with a calculator that occasionally wore a suit. His second wife was still with him, a woman named Diane who was 20 years younger and who had learned early in the marriage that the price of luxury was silence. She did not ask where Richard went. She did not ask why he came home late. She did not ask about the phone calls he took in his study with the door locked. She shopped, she decorated, she attended galas and smiled for photographs and told everyone that Richard was a wonderful husband, and if her smile never quite reached her eyes, well, that was the price of the mansion and the Mercedes and the black American Express card that never declined. Richard had one brother. His name was David, and David Whitmore was dead. He had been dead for 6 years, and in the Whitmore family, his name was not spoken. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not at the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, where Richard stood at the podium and talked about family values and giving back to the community while wearing a watch that cost more than most people's houses. David's name had been erased from the family as thoroughly as if someone had taken a pen and scratched it out of the Bible that sat on their mother's coffee table. And in a way, that is exactly what had happened. Because 20 years ago, David Whitmore had done something unforgivable. He had fallen in love. Her name was Grace Carter. She was 23 years old, a nursing student at Texas Southern University with a laugh that could fill a room and a heart that could fill a city. She was kind, she was funny, she was brilliant, she was beautiful, and she was black. And in the Whitmore family, a family whose money went back 4 generations and whose prejudice went back even further, that was a sin that could not be forgiven, a stain that could not be cleaned, a line that could not be crossed. When David brought Grace home for dinner, his mother Eleanor set down her fork, looked at her youngest son, and said, in a voice as cold and smooth as marble, "David, we need to speak privately." What was said in that private conversation only David and Eleanor knew for certain. But David left the house that night with red eyes and a clenched jaw, and told Grace in the car that they would never go back. They would never need to go back. They had each other, and that was enough. But the Whitmores did not simply disapprove, they punished. Richard, the eldest son, the golden child, the heir who had always done everything right, who had married a suitable woman from a suitable family with suitable skin, Richard led the charge. He called a meeting with the family lawyers. He restructured the family trust. He drafted a letter, cold and precise as a scalpel, informing David that he was no longer a beneficiary of the Whitmore estate, that his access to the family accounts was terminated, that his position at Whitmore Capital was dissolved, and that any further contact would be met with legal action. He had the letter couriered to David's apartment on a Tuesday morning. He did not call. He did not visit. He did not even sign it by hand. The signature was a stamp, the kind used on bulk correspondence, and that detail, more than the money or the job or the legal threats, was what broke David's heart. His brother had not even thought him worth the effort of a signature. David and Grace married in the small ceremony in a park in 3rd Ward. 12 people attended. No one from the Whitmore family was among them. David wore a borrowed suit. Grace wore a white dress she found at a thrift store on Alameda Road, and she looked so beautiful in it that David cried when she walked toward him. And he was not ashamed of the tears because he understood what she had given him, what she had shown him, that love was not a transaction, that family was not a brand, that the measure of a man was not the size of his bank account, but the size of his courage. And marrying Grace Carter was the bravest thing David Whitmore ever did. They were happy. They were poor, but they were happy. David found work as a financial analyst at a small firm downtown. Grace finished her nursing degree and got a job at Ben Taub Hospital. They rented a small apartment in Midtown, and they filled it with secondhand furniture and fresh flowers and the sound of laughter. When Grace got pregnant, David painted the spare bedroom yellow because they did not know if it would be a boy or a girl. And yellow, he said, was the color of sunshine, and their child would be raised in sunshine no matter what. The baby was a boy. They named him Elijah. David held him in the hospital and looked at Grace and said, "He has your eyes." And Grace laughed and said, "He has your stubbornness." And they were right on both counts. But happiness in this world is not always allowed to last. And the Whitmore family, even from a distance, cast a long shadow. David tried once, only once, to reach out to his brother. Elijah was 3 months old. David wrote a letter, a real letter, handwritten on plain paper, and he included a photograph of the baby. He wrote that he did not want money. He did not want back into the business. He only wanted his brother to know that he had a nephew, a beautiful, healthy nephew, and that the door was open if Richard ever wanted to walk through it. He mailed the letter to Richard's office. He never received a response. What he did not know, what he would never know, was that Richard had opened the letter, had looked at the photograph, had stared at it for a long time, and then had fed both the letter and the photograph into the shredder beside his desk. The machine chewed them up with a sound like grinding teeth, and Richard went back to his spreadsheet, and that was that. A nephew reduced to confetti. A brother's olive branch turned to dust. 2 years later, Grace collapsed in the kitchen of their apartment. The aneurysm was sudden and massive. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. David found her on the floor when he came home from work, and the sound he made when he saw her, the sound that came from his body, was not a scream and not a cry, but something older and deeper, a sound that human beings have made since the beginning of time, when the person they love most in the world is taken from them without warning, without reason, without mercy. He fell to his knees beside her and held her hand was still warm, and that was the cruelest part, that she was still warm, that her body had not yet understood that she was gone. Ruth Carter arrived within the hour. She took the baby. She held David while he wept. She made the funeral arrangements because David could not. She sat beside him in the church and gripped his hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because sometimes the only comfort you can offer is your presence, the simple, stubborn act of being there. David lasted 4 more years. He functioned. He went to work. He came home. He visited Elijah every weekend at Ruth's apartment because he had asked Ruth to raise the boy, not because he did not love his son, but because he did not trust himself to do it alone. Because the grief had hollowed him out and left him brittle, and he was terrified of breaking in front of the child. He paid Ruth what he could. He brought groceries. He sat on the floor and played with Elijah and read him books and made him laugh. And for those few hours every Saturday, the hollowness filled up just enough to keep him going. Then, one rainy night in October, David Whitmore drove his car into a concrete barrier on Interstate 45. The police report said he lost control on a wet road. The toxicology report said his blood alcohol was 3 times the legal limit. Ruth Carter, sitting in her kitchen when the officers came to the door, did not need a police report to understand what had happened. She knew that David had been dying slowly since Grace died, and that the barrier on I-45 was just the thing that finally caught up with him. She thanked the officers. She closed the door. She sat down at the kitchen table where Elijah was coloring, and she said, "Baby, your daddy loved you very much, and he's with your mama now." Elijah looked up from his crayon and said, "In heaven?" And Ruth said, "Yes, baby, in heaven." And Elijah nodded, as if this made sense, as if 5-year-olds are supposed to understand death, and went back to coloring. And Ruth put her hands over her face and wept as quietly as she could. David left nothing. No savings, no life insurance, no will, and certainly no connection to the Whitmore family fortune, because Richard had seen to that 20 years ago with his lawyers and his letter and his rubber-stamped signature. Ruth Carter, a woman with failing eyes and a fixed income, became the sole guardian of a child who by blood was entitled to hundreds of millions of dollars. But she did not know this. She did not know that Elijah's father was a Whitmore. David had stopped using the name years before his death. He had taken Grace's last name when they married, a quiet act of rebellion and love. And so Elijah was a Carter, and Ruth was a Carter, and the Whitmores did not exist in their world at all. The coffee can on the refrigerator was their bank. The intersection on Scott Street was their stock exchange. And love, that stubborn, underfunded, unbreakable love, was their only wealth. Now you understand the world Elijah lived in. Now you understand the world Richard Whitmore lived in. And now I must tell you about the day those two worlds collided. Because it was a Tuesday afternoon in July at a red light on the corner of Scott Street and Wheeler Avenue. And everything that happened after that moment would change both of their lives forever. The heat that day was brutal. The kind of Houston heat that does not just warm you, but attacks you, wrapping around your body like a wet blanket and squeezing the air out of your lungs. The asphalt was so hot that Elijah could feel it through the soles of his sneakers, a dull burn that made him shift from foot to foot like a boxer. He had been out since 10 in the morning. It was now nearly 2 in the afternoon. He had sold 11 bottles. 13 remained in the cooler, floating in water that had been ice 3 hours ago, but was now just lukewarm soup. His t-shirt was soaked through with sweat. His lips were dry and cracked. But he did not drink any of the water himself, because every bottle he drank was $1 they could not put in the coffee can, and the rent was due in 9 days, and they were still $63 short. The light turned red. Cars slowed. Elijah grabbed 2 bottles from the cooler and stepped off the curb. He moved quickly, weaving between the first few cars with practiced ease. Most drivers ignored him. A few waved him off. One woman in a Toyota rolled down her window, handed him $2, and took a bottle with a smile that made Elijah's afternoon a little brighter. He tucked the bills into his pocket and moved to the next lane, where a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class sat gleaming like a polished shoe. Its windows tinted so dark that Elijah could not see the driver inside. He approached the car the way he always did, gently, respectfully. He did not bang on the window. He did not shout. He simply walked up to the passenger side, held a water bottle at window level, and gave a small, polite wave. He waited. The window did not move. He leaned forward slightly and tapped the glass with one knuckle, a tap so light it was barely a sound, more like a whisper than a knock. That is when the window came down. And that is when Elijah Carter met Richard Whitmore for the first time. Richard was on the phone. He was always on the phone. He was in the middle of a call with his chief financial officer about a deal that was closing on Friday, a leveraged buyout of a hospital chain in Dallas, and the numbers were not lining up. And Richard was angry because the numbers always lined up when he was in charge, and if they were not lining up now, it was because someone had made a mistake, and Richard Whitmore did not tolerate mistakes. He had been sitting in traffic for 10 minutes, which was 10 minutes too long, because time was money, and his time was worth approximately $900 an hour, and the heat was making the leather seats stick to his back, even with the air conditioning on full blast. And when he heard the small tap on his window, something inside him snapped. He turned his head and saw the boy. Small, skinny, dark skin, sweaty t-shirt too big for his frame, holding up a water bottle with both hands like an offering. And something about that image, that small dark child pressing against his pristine black car, triggered a reaction in Richard that was not about the water bottle or the tap on the window, but about something much deeper and much uglier. Something that had been planted in him long ago by a family that measured the value of human beings by the color of their skin and the size of their bank accounts. Richard lowered the phone from his ear. He pressed the window button. The glass slid down with a mechanical hum. The heat rushed in like an invader, and with it came the smell of exhaust and hot pavement and the faint sweetness of the boy's sweat. Richard looked at Elijah. Elijah looked back at him. For 1 second, there was just that. 2 sets of eyes meeting, one pair old and cold and the color of slate, the other pair young and wide and the color of dark earth. Then Richard opened his mouth. "Get away from my car," he said, his voice low and tight, like a wire about to snap. Elijah blinked. He was used to being told no. He was used to drivers waving him off, shaking their heads, ignoring him entirely. But the way this man said it, the way his lips barely moved, the way his eyes narrowed, as if Elijah were not a child, but something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his shoe, that was different. That was something Elijah had not encountered before in his short life of selling water on street corners. "I'm sorry, sir," Elijah said softly, taking a step back. "I just wanted to know if you would like some cold water. It's only $1. Richard's jaw tightened. A vein pulsed at his temple. He looked at the bottle, then at the small fingerprint smudge on the passenger window where Elijah had tapped. And something about that smudge, that tiny mark left by a child's finger on his $60,000 car, pushed him past the edge of irritation into something darker and more dangerous. He snatched the bottle from Elijah's hand. The movement was so fast that Elijah flinched, his whole body jerking backward like a startled animal. Richard held the bottle for 1 second, staring at it as if it were contaminated, and then he threw it. He threw it hard. He threw it directly at the boy. The plastic bottle struck Elijah in the face, on the bridge of his nose, with a sound that was not loud but was sharp, a wet plastic crack that cut through the noise of traffic like a slap. Elijah stumbled backward. His sneakers slipped on the hot asphalt. He fell. He fell hard, his palms scraping the road, his cooler tipping sideways, bottles rolling out across the pavement like scattered marbles. He did not cry, not immediately. He sat there on the hot ground, his nose stinging, his eyes watering from the impact, his palms burning from the asphalt, and he looked up at the man in the Mercedes with an expression that was not anger and not fear, but confusion. Pure, clean, childlike confusion. Because Elijah Carter, despite everything he had endured in his 7 years, despite the poverty and the loss and the daily struggle, had never had an adult throw something at his face. He simply did not understand it. His brain could not process it. The world, in that moment, did not make sense. "Don't you ever touch my car again," Richard snarled, jabbing a finger toward the boy. "Where are your parents? What kind of people let their kids run around in the street like animals? Get out of the road before someone runs you over. Go!" The light turned green. Richard's window glided up. The Mercedes pulled away with a purr of its engine, smooth and powerful. And Elijah was left sitting on the hot asphalt, water bottles scattered around him, a red mark forming on the bridge of his nose, and a feeling inside his chest that he would carry with him for a long time. A feeling like something important had been broken. Not a bone, not a toy, but something invisible and essential. The belief that adults were safe, that strangers could be trusted, that the world, despite its hardness, was basically fair. What neither Richard nor Elijah knew was that the car directly behind the Mercedes, a silver Honda Civic driven by a woman named Patricia Lamb, had a dashcam. And that dashcam had captured everything. The approach, the grab, the throw, the child falling, the finger jabbing, the Mercedes pulling away. Every frame, every second, every detail. Patricia Lamb was a 32-year-old graphic designer who had never in her life posted a video on social media. But that afternoon, after she pulled over and helped Elijah gather his scattered bottles, after she gave him a $20 bill and asked if he was okay, after she watched him limp back to the sidewalk with his half-empty cooler, she went home and watched the dashcam footage 3 times. And on the third viewing, with tears running down her face, she uploaded it to Twitter with a caption that read, "This man threw a water bottle into a child's face for tapping on his car window. Houston, do you know who this is? This child deserves better." By midnight, the video had 2 million views. By the next morning, it had 12 million. By the end of the week, it would reach 200 million views across every platform on the internet. And the man in the Mercedes would be identified, and the child on the ground would be found. And a story would unfold that was so much bigger and so much stranger than anyone could have imagined. A story about blood and money and the terrible cost of hatred. A story about a family that threw away one of its own, and a child who came back to claim what was always his. But that is getting ahead of things. Let me tell you what happened next. Elijah walked home that afternoon slower than usual. His cooler was lighter. He had lost 4 bottles when he fell, their caps cracking open on the asphalt, the water spilling away into the gutter. His palms were raw and spotted with tiny bits of gravel embedded in the skin. His nose had stopped hurting but was swollen, and he could feel a dull throb with each step, a pulse of pain synchronized with his heartbeat. He climbed the stairs to the apartment, each step an effort, and when he opened the door, the smell of the apartment hit him the way it always did. That familiar blend of dish soap and canned food and the faint chemical smell of his grandmother's eye drops. And for the first time all day, his eyes filled with tears. Ruth was in the kitchen. She was seated at the table, her fingers tracing the raised dots of a prayer booklet in Braille that the church had given her. She heard the door. She heard his footsteps, and she heard something else. Something in the quality of the silence between his steps, an irregularity, a hesitation, that told her something was wrong. Ruth Carter could not see her grandson, but she could hear his pain as clearly as a church bell. "Elijah?" she said, turning her head toward the door. "Baby, what happened?" He stood in the doorway. The tears were coming now, hot and fast, cutting clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He tried to speak, his mouth opened, but the words stuck in his throat like a fishbone, and instead of words, a sound came out. A small, strangled hiccup that was the sound of a 7-year-old boy trying very hard to be brave and failing. Ruth pushed back her chair. She stood. She moved toward him with the careful precision of a blind woman who has memorized every inch of her home. 3 steps to the counter, turn right. 4 steps to the door. and she reached him and knelt down and put her hands on his arms and felt the grit on his palms and the heat of his skin and the shaking of his small body, and she pulled him close. He pressed his face into her shoulder, and the dam broke. He cried the way children cry when they have been holding it in great gasping sobs that shook his whole frame, his fingers clutching her shirt so tight that his knuckles ached. "Tell me," Ruth said, her voice steady and low, the voice she used when the world was falling apart, the voice that said, "I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and nothing can hurt you while I am holding you. Tell Grandma what happened." And he told her. Between sobs, in broken sentences, he told her about the black car and the angry man and the bottle that hit his face and the way he fell and the bottles that rolled away and the words the man said, those terrible words about parents and animals and the street. And with each word the boy spoke, Ruth Carter felt something rise inside her chest that was older than anger and deeper than pain, something that had been rising in black grandmothers since the beginning of this country. A fury so quiet and so vast that it could not be expressed in shouts or violence, but only in the tightening of arms around a child and the silent promise that this right here, would not stand. She held him until the crying slowed. She cleaned his palms with warm water and hydrogen peroxide, blowing on the scrapes the way she had blown on Grace's scrapes 30 years ago. She put a cold washcloth on his nose and sat him at the table and made him a peanut butter sandwich, cutting it diagonal the way he liked, and she sat across from him and listened to him eat, and she did not cry, not in front of him, because her job was to be the strong one, the steady one, the wall between this child and a world that seemed determined to knock him down. That night, after Elijah was asleep, Ruth sat alone in the kitchen. The faucet dripped. The refrigerator hummed. The coffee can sat on its shelf, silent and patient. Ruth pressed her hands together and prayed. She prayed the way she always prayed, not in fancy words or memorized scripture, but in plain, honest language, the way you talk to someone you know. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand why people are so cruel. I don't understand why a grown man would hurt a child. But you do. You see everything. And I'm asking you, not for revenge, because that's not mine, but for justice. Justice for that boy. Justice for this family. I'm tired, Lord. My eyes are gone, and my body is wearing out, and I don't know how much longer I can do this. But I will do it as long as you need me to. Just show me the way." The prayer hung in the dark kitchen like smoke from a candle. Ruth did not know that the way was already being shown, that at that very moment, across the city, a video was spreading like wildfire across the internet, and that the flames of that fire would reach all the way to the Whitmore family mansion in River Oaks and burn it to the ground. Not the house. The house was made of stone and money and would stand for 100 years. What would burn was the lie. The 20-year lie that the Whitmores had told themselves, that they could throw away a brother, erase his name, deny his child, and never face a reckoning. That lie was about to burn, and the ashes would change everything. The next morning, Elijah went back to the intersection. Ruth tried to stop him. She stood in the doorway, her hand on the frame, her blind eyes pointed at the sound of him filling his cooler, and said, "Baby, you don't have to go today. Rest. Your hands need to heal." Elijah looked at his palms. They were covered in Band-Aids, a patchwork of tanned adhesive strips that made his hands look like small quilts. He flexed his fingers. They stung. But the rent was due in 8 days, and the coffee can was still $63 short. Or actually, 67 now, because he had lost 4 bottles yesterday, and 4 bottles was $4, and $4 was the difference between maybe making it and definitely not. "I know, Grandma," he said, and his voice was steady in a way that made Ruth's chest ache, because steadiness in a 7-year-old is not a virtue, it is a wound. "But we need the money, and that man isn't going to be there today. It was just one bad person. Most people are nice." Ruth stood there for a long moment. The faucet dripped. The clock on the wall ticked. Then she nodded. Because what could she say? He was right. They needed the money. And she could not see to work, could not drive, could not do anything but sit in this apartment and pray and wait. And if this child, this brave, stubborn, beautiful child, wanted to go out and fight for their survival, She did not have the right to stop him. She only had the right to love him, and so she did, fiercely, as he walked out the door and pulled it shut behind him with a soft click that echoed in the empty apartment like the closing of a chapter. Meanwhile, the internet was on fire. Patricia Lamb's video, posted at 9:30 the previous evening, had gained traction through the night. A local Houston news anchor retweeted it. Then a national journalist. Then an athlete with 10 million followers. By the time Elijah was setting up his cooler on the corner of Scott Street, the video had crossed 20 million views and was climbing with the relentless momentum of a thing that has touched a nerve so deep that people cannot look away. Comments poured in by the thousands. Who is this man? Someone find this child. This breaks my heart. What kind of monster does this to a kid? The hashtag appeared around 7 in the morning. Find Water Bottle Boy. By noon, it was trending #1 in the United States. The identification of Richard Whitmore happened at 11:14 a.m. when a user on Twitter with a gift for internet research cross-referenced the license plate visible in the dashcam footage with public records and corporate filings and announced, with the triumphant energy of a detective cracking a case, that the Mercedes belonged to Richard Allen Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Capital Partners, net worth estimated at $460 million. The announcement landed like a bomb. A billionaire. A billionaire threw a water bottle at a homeless child selling water. A billionaire in a car worth more than the child's entire building screamed at a 7-year-old for touching his window. The narrative wrote itself. David versus Goliath. Rich versus poor. Cruelty versus innocence. And the internet, that vast and merciless arena, chose its side instantly and unanimously. Richard Whitmore's name began trending. His company's website crashed under the traffic. His corporate headshot, that carefully composed photograph of a man in a charcoal suit with silver hair and a practiced smile, was everywhere, placed side by side with the still frame of Elijah falling to the ground. The contrast was devastating. Here was wealth and cruelty. Here was poverty and dignity. And the distance between them, measured in a single thrown water bottle, was the distance between everything that was wrong with the world and everything that was right. Richard learned about the video at 12:15 p.m. when his assistant, a young woman named Chloe, who had been fielding calls all morning with increasing panic, finally worked up the courage to walk into his office, close the door, and tell him. She placed her phone on his desk with the video paused on the opening frame and said, in a voice that trembled slightly, "Mr. Whitmore, you need to see this." Richard watched the video. He watched it without moving. His face did not change. His body did not shift. He watched himself grab the bottle. He watched himself throw it. He watched the child fall. He watched his own finger jabbing toward the boy. And when the video ended, he sat in silence for exactly 4 seconds. And then he said, "Who posted this?" "A woman in the car behind you," Chloe said. "It's from her dashcam. It has—" She paused. She swallowed. "It has 40 million views." The number hung in the air between them, like a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. Richard's jaw clenched. The muscle at the corner of his mouth twitched, a tiny involuntary movement that Chloe had learned to recognize as the precursor to an explosion, the way the air pressure drops before a storm. But the explosion did not come. Instead, Richard's voice went quiet, which was worse. "Get me the lawyers," he said. "All of them. And get me the head of our PR firm. I want them in this office in 1 hour." "Mr. Whitmore," Chloe said carefully. "The phones have been ringing all morning. Reporters, news stations. Our investors are calling. And," she hesitated, "there are people outside the building, with signs." Richard stood. He walked to his window, which overlooked the parking lot of the Whitmore Capital building in the Galleria area. Below, on the sidewalk, a small but growing cluster of people stood holding hand-painted signs. "Shame on Whitmore. Protect our children. Water Bottle Boy deserves justice." A news van from Channel 13 was parked across the street, its satellite dish extended toward the sky like a mechanical flower. A reporter was speaking into a camera. Richard stood at the window and looked down at all of it, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something that was not anger or calculation or control. He felt fear. Cold, slithering animal fear. The kind that comes when you realize that the world you have built, the world of money and power and walls and silence, has a crack in it. And through that crack, the light is coming. And in that light, everything will be seen. He stepped back from the window. He straightened his tie. He turned to Chloe. 1 hour, he repeated. Lawyers, PR, my office. The meeting lasted 3 hours. 6 lawyers, 2 PR executives, and Richard Whitmore sat around a conference table that cost $30,000, arguing about the best way to contain a crisis that was growing faster than they could strategize. The PR team wanted an apology, a public statement. Richard standing before cameras, humbled and remorseful, maybe with his wife beside him for the sympathy factor. The lawyers were divided. Half wanted silence, the standard corporate playbook of saying nothing and waiting for the next news cycle to bury the story. The other half agreed with the PR team, but wanted the apology carefully scripted, vetted, and legally airtight, with no admission of wrongdoing that could be used in a potential lawsuit. Richard listened to all of them. He sat at the head of the table with his hands folded and his face unreadable. And when they had finished, when every argument had been made and every strategy proposed, he said 3 words that silenced the room. It was just water. The lawyers exchanged glances. The PR executives stared. Chloe, who was taking notes in the corner, stopped writing. Mr. Whitmore, said Douglas Peel, the senior partner at the PR firm, a man who had spent 30 years cleaning up messes for rich people and who had thought he had seen everything until today. With all due respect, it was not just water. It was a grown man throwing an object at a child's face, and it was captured on video, and 200 million people have watched it. This is beyond water. This is your reputation. This is your company's stock. This is potentially criminal assault charges. Richard's eyes flicked to Peel with the cold, flat expression of a man who is not accustomed to being told what things are. The boy was touching my car. He was in the street. He was unsupervised. Where were his parents? Why isn't anyone asking that question? Silence. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning became audible, a low mechanical drone that seemed to underline the emptiness of what Richard had just said. Chloe looked down at her notepad. One of the younger lawyers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Douglas Peel pressed his lips together and chose his next words with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. Asking that question publicly, Peel said slowly, would be catastrophic. The boy is 7 years old. He is selling water to help pay his family's rent. His parents are deceased. He is being raised by his blind grandmother. All of this information is now public. If you go on camera and question where his parents are, you will be finished. Not hurt, finished. Richard stared at Peel. The vein at his temple pulsed. His fingers tightened against each other, knuckle pressing against knuckle until the skin turned white. He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that the world had gone soft, that a man had a right to his property, that children should not be wandering in traffic, that he was the victim here, that his reputation was being destroyed over a minor incident that anyone could have had in a moment of frustration. He wanted to say all of this, and the wanting burned inside him like acid, but some small survival instinct, some reptilian part of his brain that understood the mathematics of public opinion, even if the rest of him refused to, kept his mouth shut. He exhaled through his nose. He unclenched his hands. "Fine," he said. "Write the apology. I'll read it. But I am not meeting with the family. I am not writing a check. And I am not admitting that I did anything wrong. I lost my temper. That's all. People lose their tempers." "That's a start," Peel said, and he said it with the careful neutrality of a man who knew it was not nearly enough. The apology video was recorded the next afternoon in Richard's office. He wore a navy suit. He sat behind his desk. He read from a teleprompter. His voice was steady and measured and contained not a single genuine emotion. He said he regretted the incident. He said his behavior did not reflect his values. He said he was committed to supporting the community. He did not say the boy's name. He did not say sorry. He said, "I regret," which, as any linguist or therapist or grandmother will tell you, is not the same thing at all. The video was uploaded to the Whitmore Capital website and distributed to news outlets, and within an hour, It was being torn apart by every commentator and viewer on the internet. Because people can smell a hollow apology the way a dog can smell fear, and this apology reeked. He didn't even say the kid's name. Look at his eyes. He's reading. He doesn't mean a word. He's sorry he got caught. That's it. This man is worth $500 million, and he can't even look at the camera. The backlash to the apology was worse than the backlash to the original video. Investors called. 2 major clients pulled their accounts from Whitmore Capital, representing $90 million in managed assets. A prominent Houston pastor, Reverend James Solomon of Ebenezer Baptist Church, gave a sermon that Sunday about the story of the Good Samaritan and the Pharisee, and without naming Richard Whitmore directly, made it very clear who the Pharisee was. The sermon went viral. Another 10 million views. The pressure built and built, like water behind a dam, and Richard sat in his mansion in River Oaks and felt the walls trembling. But the story was about to take a turn that no one expected. Not the internet, not the reporters, not the PR team, and certainly not Richard Whitmore. Because a woman named Loretta Hayes was watching the news, and Loretta Hayes knew something about Elijah Carter that no one else in the world knew. Loretta Hayes was 71 years old. She had been a nurse at St. Joseph Medical Center in Houston for 38 years before retiring. She had delivered thousands of babies, comforted hundreds of families, and kept secrets that would fill a library. She was the kind of woman who wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and called everyone sugar, and had a memory like a steel trap, sharp and relentless and incapable of letting go. And when she saw the video of the water bottle boy, when she saw the name Elijah Carter scroll across the bottom of the screen, and when a reporter mentioned that the boy was being raised by his blind grandmother Ruth Carter after the deaths of both his parents, something clicked in Loretta's mind with the precision and force of a lock tumbling open. She remembered. She remembered a night 8 years ago. She remembered a young couple, terrified and joyful, arriving at the hospital. She remembered the woman, Grace Carter, beautiful and strong, pushing with everything she had. She remembered the man beside her, holding her hand, pale and shaking, whispering encouragements that were half prayer. She remembered the man's face, his sharp features and light eyes, the way he looked at the baby when it was placed on Grace's chest, the way his whole body seemed to soften, the way he said, "He has your eyes." She remembered all of this because Loretta Hayes never forgot a birth. But what she remembered most was the paperwork, the intake forms, the section where the father listed his full legal name, and the name he had written in careful block letters was David Allen Whitmore. Loretta set down her coffee cup. She picked up her phone. She called the one person she knew who would understand the significance of what she had just remembered, her nephew, Terrence Hayes, who happened to be a civil rights attorney with an office on Main Street and a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers considered too explosive to touch. "Terrence," she said when he picked up, "you need to turn on the news. That water bottle boy. I delivered him, and sugar, I remember his daddy's name, and it is the same name as the man who hit him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Terrence said quietly, "Say that again." "The boy's father," Loretta said, her voice steady and sure, "was David Whitmore. I remember it because it was unusual. The mama was black and the daddy was white, and I remember thinking what a beautiful couple they were, and the name Whitmore stuck with me because the Whitmores are one of those old Houston families. I thought it was a coincidence at the time, but now I'm looking at this man on the news, this Richard Whitmore, and Terrence, I'm telling you, the resemblance between him and that boy's father is not a coincidence. They have the same jaw, the same eyes. These are brothers." Terrence Hayes sat down at his desk. He opened his laptop. He began to search. And what he found over the next 72 hours would unravel the Whitmore family in ways that no video, no apology, no PR strategy could contain. Because the truth, once it starts moving, is like a river that has broken through a dam, and no amount of money or power or silence can push it back. The investigation began quietly. Terrence was thorough. He was methodical. He did not rush, because he understood that what he was holding was not just a case, but a bomb. And the bomb handled carelessly does as much damage to the person holding it as to the target. He started with public records, marriage certificates, birth certificates, death certificates. He found David Allen Whitmore's marriage to Grace Elaine Carter, filed at the Harris County Clerk's office. He found Elijah David Carter's birth certificate, listing David Allen Whitmore as the father. He found David's death certificate. He found Grace's death certificate. And then he dug deeper, into corporate filings, into trust documents, into the labyrinthine structure of the Whitmore family estate. What he found was damning. The Whitmore Family Trust, established by Richard and David's father, William Whitmore, in 1987, contained a provision that was standard among wealthy families, but critical in this context. The estate was to be distributed equally among William's direct descendants, not just his children, his descendants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, anyone who carried the Whitmore blood. The trust had been amended in 2005, the year David was disowned, to remove David as a named beneficiary. But the amendment, drafted by Richard's lawyers in haste and anger, had a flaw. It removed David by name. It did not revoke the rights of David's descendants. It could not, because at the time of the amendment, no one knew that David would have a child. The provision for descendants remained intact, a single paragraph buried on page 47 of an 83-page document. A paragraph that said, in the dry and precise language of trusts and estates law, that any biological descendant of William Reginald Whitmore was entitled to an equal share of the trust corpus upon reaching the age of majority, or earlier upon petition by a legal guardian. Terence read that paragraph 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair and whistled softly through his teeth. Then he picked up his phone and called his Aunt Loretta. "We're going to need a DNA test," he said, "and we're going to need to talk to the grandmother." The meeting with Ruth Carter happened on a Saturday morning. Terence drove to the apartment on Colon Boulevard. He parked on the street. He climbed the stairs and stood before the door with its peeling paint and its crooked number. And he took a breath, because he was about to tell a blind woman and a 7-year-old boy that their lives were about to change in ways they could not imagine. And that was the kind of conversation that required care, required gentleness, required the kind of respect that you give to people who have survived things that would break most of us. Ruth opened the door. She did not know who he was. Elijah stood behind her, peering around her hip with those large, serious eyes. Terence introduced himself. He said he was a lawyer. He said he was there about Elijah's father. And when he said David's name, Ruth Carter's hand tightened on the doorframe, and her blind eyes widened, and she said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "What do you know about David?" "May I come in?" Terence asked. She let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Elijah counted his dollars, the same table where the coffee can held its crumpled prayers. Elijah was sent to his room, though Terence suspected the boy was listening from the hallway, because 7-year-olds always listen from hallways. Terence spoke carefully. He told Ruth what he had found. He told her that David's full name was David Allen Whitmore. He told her about the Whitmore family, about the fortune, about the trust. He told her that Richard Whitmore, the man in the video, the man who had thrown a water bottle at her grandson's face, was David's older brother, Elijah's uncle, and that under the terms of the family trust, Elijah was potentially entitled to a share of an estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ruth sat very still. The faucet dripped, the clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed its low, steady hymn. Ruth's hands were folded on the table, her fingers interlaced, and Terence watched them and saw that they were not shaking. They were perfectly still, rock still. The stillness of a woman who had endured so much that one more revelation, even one this enormous, could not move her. "David never told me his family name," she said finally. "He told me his family disowned him for marrying Grace. He said they were rich. He said they were cruel. He said he didn't want their money or their name, and Grace didn't either. She loved him for who he was, not what he came from. And when he died, I thought that was the end of it. I thought whatever family he had was gone." "They are very much here," Terence said gently. "And Mrs. Carter, I have to be honest with you. The man who hurt Elijah, the man in the video, he is the head of that family. And he has been sitting on a fortune that, by rights, partly belongs to your grandson." Ruth was quiet for a long time. In the other room, there was the faint creak of a floorboard that confirmed what Terrence had suspected about Elijah and the hallway. Then Ruth spoke, and what she said surprised him. "I don't want their money," she said. "I never asked for it, and I don't want it. But I do want justice for that boy. Not just for the water bottle, for everything. For what they did to David. For how they threw him away like garbage. For how they pretended his child didn't exist. If there is justice to be had, Mr. Hayes, then I want it. Not for me, for Elijah, for David, for Grace, for all of them." Terrence nodded. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Her skin was papery and warm. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I am going to get that justice, and the money is part of it, whether you want it or not. Because that money was stolen, not with a gun, with a pen. And we are going to take it back." The DNA test was the next step. Terrence arranged it through a private laboratory, a company that specialized in paternity and kinship analysis, and that understood the need for discretion. A simple cheek swab from Elijah, compared against publicly available genetic databases, and eventually against the Whitmore family records that would be subpoenaed as part of the legal proceedings. The results came back in 8 days. They were unequivocal. Elijah David Carter was the biological grandson of William Reginald Whitmore and the biological nephew of Richard Allen Whitmore. The blood was the blood, the line was the line, and no amount of lawyers or letters or rubber-stamp signatures could change what was written in the boy's cells. Terrence filed the petition on a Monday morning. It was a masterpiece of legal precision, a 40-page document that laid out the family history, the trust provisions, the DNA evidence, and the claim with the clarity and force of a closing argument. He filed it in Harris County Probate Court, and he also filed a separate civil suit against Richard Whitmore personally, alleging assault on a minor, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and breach of fiduciary duty as trustee of the Whitmore Family Trust. He sent copies to every major news outlet in Houston, and then he waited. He did not have to wait long. The media, already inflamed by the water bottle video and the hollow apology, seized on the new information with the hunger of a starving animal presented with a feast. The headlines wrote themselves. Water bottle billionaire attacked his own nephew. Disowned brother's secret child is heir to Whitmore fortune. Blind grandmother and 7-year-old boy take on billionaire uncle. The story was no longer a simple case of a rich man behaving badly. It was a saga, a parable, a folktale brought to life in the modern age, complete with a villain and a hero and a secret and a reckoning. Richard learned about the lawsuit at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning, when his chief legal counsel, a man named Bernard Knox, walked into his office with a face the color of old paper and set the petition on his desk. Richard read the first page, then the second. Then he stopped reading and looked up at Knox, and his face had undergone a transformation that Knox had never seen before. The mask was off. The control was gone. In its place was something raw and wild and cornered, the face of a man who has just realized that the walls he built to keep the world out are the same walls that are now closing in. "This is not possible," Richard said. His voice cracked on the last word, a hairline fracture that ran through the syllable like a crack through glass. "It is possible," Knox said quietly. "And it is true. We have confirmed the DNA results independently. The boy is David's son. He is a direct descendant of your father. And under the terms of the trust, he has a legitimate claim." Richard stood up. He paced to the window. He paced back. He placed both hands on his desk and leaned forward, his weight on his arms, his head hanging between his shoulders. "My brother took her name," he said, almost to himself. "He took her name, Carter. That's why we never knew. We never knew he had a child." "No," Knox said. "You never looked." The words landed like a slap. Richard's head snapped up. His eyes found Knox's. For 1 second, something passed between the two men that was not business and not law, but something personal and unflinching. A moment of naked truth. Then Richard's face hardened again, the mask sliding back into place, imperfect now, cracked, but still there. "Fight it," Richard said. Every line, every claim, every dollar. We fight it." Knox hesitated. "Richard," he said, and the use of the first name was itself a signal, a departure from the usual Mr. Whitmore that indicated the gravity of what he was about to say. "I strongly advise against that. The public sentiment is already against you. If you fight this child's claim to the trust, the optics will be devastating. You will be the billionaire who threw a water bottle at his own nephew and then tried to steal his inheritance. No court, no jury, no judge in Harris County will side with you, and the press will eat you alive." "Then let them eat," Richard snapped. "That trust was my father's legacy, my legacy. I built Whitmore Capital. I grew that fortune. David walked away. He chose that woman. He chose poverty. He chose to abandon everything this family stands for. And now his son, some kid I've never met, is going to walk in and take half of everything? No, absolutely not." "He's not asking for half," Knox said carefully. "The petition requests a 1/3 share based on 3 living descendants of William Whitmore, you, your sister Margaret, and Elijah. That's approximately $153 million. Richard laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of disbelief, a bitter barking sound that bounced off the office walls and came back sounding like a sob. $153 million. For a kid selling water on the street. For my brother's mistake." Knox said nothing. He picked up the petition from the desk. He placed it in his briefcase. He closed the clasps with 2 precise clicks that sounded, in the silence of the office, like the cocking of a gun. "I'll prepare our response," he said. "But Richard, for the record, I want you to know that I believe this is a mistake. The boy has a valid claim, the trust language is clear, and the court of public opinion has already reached its verdict." He left. The door closed. Richard stood alone in his office. The Houston skyline stretched beyond his window, glass and steel glittering in the afternoon sun, a monument to ambition and wealth and the relentless machinery of money. But Richard was not looking at the skyline. He was looking at his own reflection in the glass, and for one unguarded moment, he saw what everyone else saw. Not a titan, not a CEO, not a billionaire, just a man who had thrown a water bottle at a child, just a man who had destroyed his brother and was now trying to destroy his brother's son. Just a man who was standing on the wrong side of history and did not know how to cross back over. The weeks that followed were a war, fought on 2 fronts, the legal front and the public front. On the legal front, Richard's army of lawyers filed motions to dismiss, motions to delay, motions to seal the records, motions to challenge the DNA evidence, motions that multiplied like weeds in a garden, each one designed to slow the case, to exhaust the opposition, to make the process so expensive and so draining that the other side would give up. It was a strategy that had worked for Richard many times before, because in the American legal system, money is not just an advantage, it is a weapon, and Richard Whitmore had more ammunition than most armies. But Terrence Hayes did not give up. Terrence Hayes had taken this case on contingency, which meant he got paid nothing unless they won, and he had taken it not for the money, but for the principle. And principle, unlike money, does not run out. On the public front, the story grew. It grew the way stories grow in the age of the internet, not in a straight line, but in an explosion, branching and forking and reaching into every corner of the culture. Podcasts covered it, documentaries were announced. A GoFundMe page set up for Elijah and Ruth raised over $2 million in 2 weeks. Celebrities weighed in, athletes weighed in, politicians weighed in. The governor of Texas, carefully sensing which way the wind was blowing, issued a statement about child welfare and the importance of family. Reverend James Solomon gave another sermon, this one about the prodigal son, except in his version, it was not the prodigal who needed forgiving, but the brother who stayed home, the brother who hoarded the inheritance and locked the door against his own blood. That sermon hit 40 million views. Ruth Carter, blind and dignified and radiating a quiet strength that the cameras loved, gave one interview, just one, to a local Houston reporter who came to the apartment on Cullen Boulevard and sat at the kitchen table and asked Ruth how she felt about all of it. Ruth thought for a moment. The faucet dripped. The coffee can sat on the refrigerator, still there, still faithful. Then Ruth said, in a voice as steady as bedrock, "I didn't raise that boy to be rich. I raised him to be good. If the law says he's owed something, then the law will decide. But I want people to know that Elijah was precious before anyone knew his last name. He was precious when he was selling water on the corner. He was precious when nobody was watching. Money doesn't make a child precious, love does. And that boy has always, always been loved." The interview aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, it had been viewed 60 million times. And Ruth Carter, a blind grandmother in a two-bedroom apartment on Cullen Boulevard, became the moral compass of a story that the entire country was watching. Richard Whitmore watched the interview too. He watched it alone, in his study, with the door locked and a glass of scotch in his hand that he did not drink. He watched Ruth Carter speak, and he heard in her voice something that he had not heard in a very long time. Something that his own mother's voice had never contained. Something that his own voice had certainly never contained. He heard love. Simple, clean, unafraid love. And it terrified him, because love was a language he had never learned, and hearing it spoken so fluently by a blind woman in a crumbling apartment made him feel, for the first time in his life, truly poor. He turned off the television. He sat in the dark. The scotch glowed amber in the glass, untouched. The house was silent around him. Diane was at a charity event, or shopping, or at her sister's, or wherever Diane went when she did not want to be near him, which was most of the time now, because even Diane, who had tolerated so much, who had swallowed so many silences and ignored so many absences, was struggling with this. She had not said anything directly. She did not say things directly, but she had started sleeping in the guest room, and when reporters called the house, she let the phone ring, and when Richard tried to talk to her about the case, she looked at him with an expression that was not anger and not disgust, but something worse, disappointment. The quiet, final disappointment of a woman who has finally seen her husband clearly and does not like what she sees. In the dark study, Richard thought about his brother. He did not want to think about David. He had spent 20 years not thinking about David, but the thoughts came anyway, unbidden, like water seeping through a crack in a wall. He thought about David as a boy, 8 years old, following Richard around the house like a shadow, asking questions that never stopped. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly south? Why does Dad work so much? Richard, will you teach me to ride a bike? And Richard had taught him. He remembered that now. He remembered holding the back of David's bicycle seat on the driveway of their parents' house, running alongside him, and then letting go, and David wobbling for one terrified second, and then finding his balance and pedaling away, and turning back with a grin so wide it seemed to split his face in half. "I did it, Richard. Did you see? I did it." Richard closed his eyes. He took a breath that shuddered in his chest like a car driving over a rough road. He opened his eyes. He picked up the scotch and drank it in one swallow, and the burn in his throat was a welcome distraction from the burn behind his eyes. He set the glass down. He stood up. He walked out of the study and closed the door, and the memories stayed behind, locked in the dark room with the empty glass, and Richard went upstairs and got into bed and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. The court date was set for October 15th, 3 months away. 3 months that felt, to everyone involved, like 3 years. Terrence used the time to build his case, gathering depositions, interviewing witnesses, compiling financial records. Richard's lawyers used the time to file more motions, each one denied, each denial another crack in the wall of Richard's defense. The public used the time to watch, to comment, to choose sides, to turn the Whitmore case into a mirror in which the entire country saw its own reflection, its own struggles with wealth and poverty, race and justice, family and betrayal. And Elijah used the time to be a child, because that is what Ruth insisted on. She insisted that despite the lawyers and the cameras and the GoFundMe and the strangers who now recognized them on the street, Elijah would go to school, do his homework, eat his vegetables, say his prayers, and go to bed on time. She did not let him watch the news. She did not let him read the comments. She did not let him see the hateful things that some people, a minority but a loud one, said about him online. The people who called him a scam, a fraud, a welfare case trying to steal a rich man's money. She shielded him from all of it with the ferocity of a lioness guarding her cub. And if sometimes, late at night, she sat alone in the kitchen and wept from the exhaustion and the fear and the weight of it all, she did so silently, so that the boy in the next room would not hear, so that his sleep would not be disturbed, so that in the morning, when he woke, his world would still be safe and small and defined by love, the way a child's world should be. The night before the court date, Elijah could not sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the apartment. The faucet dripping, the refrigerator humming, the distant wail of a siren somewhere in the city. He knew, in the way that children know things, that tomorrow was important. He did not understand the legal details. He did not understand trusts or estates or DNA tests. But he understood that a man had hurt him, and that the man was related to his father, and that tomorrow, in a big building downtown, people in suits were going to decide what happened next. He understood that much. He got out of bed. He padded down the hallway in his bare feet, the carpet rough under his toes, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. Ruth was there. Of course she was there. She was sitting at the table with her hands folded and her lips moving silently, praying the way she always prayed in the dark, her conversation with God ongoing and intimate and as natural as breathing. "Grandma?" Elijah said. Ruth turned her head. "Baby, you should be sleeping." "I can't sleep," he said. He crossed the kitchen and climbed into the chair beside her. The chair was too big for him, and his feet dangled above the floor, swinging slowly back and forth. "Grandma, are you scared?" Ruth reached out and found his hand. First try, as always. "Scared of what, baby?" Tomorrow, the court, the man. Ruth squeezed his hand. She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts the way she always did, choosing her words with the same care she used when navigating the apartment, testing each one before putting her weight on it. "I am not scared," she said, "because I know who I am, and I know who you are, and I know that the truth is on our side. The truth is a heavy thing, baby. It can feel like a burden, but it is also a shield. And tomorrow, we are going to carry that shield into that courtroom, and no one, not that man, not his lawyers, not all the money in the world, can break it." Elijah was quiet. His feet swung. Then he said, in a small voice that carried more weight than any closing argument, "Grandma, do you think my daddy would be proud of me?" Ruth's breath caught. A sound escaped her lips that was not a word, but a small, involuntary expression of pain and love combined. The sound a heart makes when it is breaking and mending at the same time. She pulled the boy close. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. She breathed in the smell of his shampoo, the cheap kind from the dollar store, coconut-scented, and she held him, and when she spoke, her voice was thick but unbroken. "Your daddy," she said, "is the proudest man in heaven right now, and your mama is sitting right beside him, smiling that big smile of hers, and they are both looking down at you and saying, 'That's our boy. That's our Elijah, and he is going to be just fine.'" Elijah nodded against her chest. His eyes were heavy. The kitchen was warm and dark and safe, and his grandmother's heartbeat was a steady drum beneath his ear. The oldest lullaby in the world, and within minutes he was asleep. Ruth held him. She did not move. She sat in the dark kitchen with the faucet dripping and the coffee can standing guard on the refrigerator, and she held her grandson, and she prayed one more prayer, the simplest one she knew. "Thank you, Lord, for this child. Protect him tomorrow. Protect us both." The courtroom was full. Not just full, packed, overflowing. Every seat taken, every wall lined with people standing shoulder to shoulder, and outside, in the corridor, more people pressed against the glass doors, craning their necks for a glimpse of the proceedings. News cameras were set up in the hallway. Reporters whispered in the microphones. The air inside the courtroom was hot and close, thick with the smell of cologne and perfume and nervous sweat. And there was an energy in the room that was almost physical, a vibrating tension that you could feel on your skin like static electricity. Ruth sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a navy blue dress that the women from her church had bought for her, her hands folded on the table, her clouded eyes fixed straight ahead at nothing and everything. Beside her, Terrence Hayes sat with his briefcase open and his case files arranged with military precision, each document tabbed and labeled and ready to deploy. At the defendant's table, Richard Whitmore sat flanked by 4 lawyers in identical dark suits, a wall of legal firepower that cost approximately $12,000 an hour. Richard's face was composed. His suit was impeccable. His hands rested on the table, still and controlled. But there was something in his eyes, a darting quality, a flicker, that betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. He looked like a man sitting on a bomb and pretending it was a chair. Elijah was not in the courtroom. Ruth had insisted. He was with the women from the church in a conference room down the hall, coloring in a book and eating the animal crackers that Deacon Williams had brought in a Ziploc bag. Ruth did not want her grandson in that room. She did not want him to see the man who had hit him. She did not want him to hear the things that would be said. She wanted to shield him, as she had always shielded him, with her body, with her love, with the fierce and total devotion of a grandmother who understood that childhood is short and fragile and must be protected at all costs. The judge's name was Honorable Patricia Okafor. She was 57 years old, a Harvard Law graduate, the daughter of Nigerian immigrants, and she had a reputation for 2 things: absolute fairness and absolute intolerance for nonsense. She entered the courtroom and took her seat, and the room fell silent with the immediacy and completeness of a held breath. "Good morning," Judge Okafor said, her voice carrying the calm authority of a woman who had spent decades commanding rooms. "This is the matter of Carter versus Whitmore. We are here to address the petition filed on behalf of the minor child, Elijah David Carter, regarding his claim to the Whitmore Family Trust, as well as the civil claims filed against Richard Allen Whitmore. I have read all the filings. I am familiar with the facts. I want to hear from counsel. Mr. Hayes, you may begin." Terrence stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the center of the courtroom with the deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was in no hurry to get there. Because the truth does not rush, the truth walks, steady and sure, and arrives exactly when it is meant to. He turned to face the judge, and he began to speak, and his voice filled the courtroom the way a preacher's voice fills a church, with conviction, with clarity, with the weight of a story that demanded to be heard. He told the story. He told it from the beginning. He told it the way a master storyteller tells a story, not with legal jargon and technicalities, but with names and faces and moments, with David and Grace and their wedding in the park, with the yellow bedroom painted for a baby not yet born, with the letter Richard shredded, with the rubber stamp signature, with Ruth in the kitchen counting coins, with Elijah on the corner selling water, with the bottle thrown and the child fallen, and the video seen by the world. He told it all, and the courtroom listened, and the silence was the kind of silence that falls when people are hearing something true. When Terrence finished his opening statement, he returned to his seat. The courtroom exhaled. Judge Okafor looked at the defense table. Mr. Knox, Bernard Knox, stood. He was a tall man, thin, with silver hair and a face that had been trained to show nothing. He walked to the center of the courtroom, and he made his case. And his case was this: the trust amendment was valid. David Whitmore had been lawfully removed as a beneficiary. The provision for descendants was ambiguous and subject to interpretation, and the petitioner's claim was without legal merit. He spoke for 35 minutes, and his arguments were technically sound and logically constructed and emotionally empty. And when he finished and sat down, the courtroom was still, and the stillness was not the stillness of persuasion, but the stillness of a room that has heard words but felt nothing. The evidence phase lasted 2 days. Terrence presented the DNA results. He presented the birth certificate. He presented the marriage certificate. He presented the trust document with the descendant clause highlighted in yellow. He presented financial records showing how the trust had grown under Richard's management, from $200 million to $460 million, and how not a single penny had ever been set aside for David's line. He presented the letter David had sent to Richard with the photograph of baby Elijah, and he told the courtroom that Richard had shredded that letter, and a murmur ran through the gallery like wind through tall grass. Richard's lawyers presented their own evidence, corporate records, board minutes, trust amendments, letters from the original trust attorney supporting their interpretation of the descendant clause. They were thorough. They were professional. They were fighting for every inch of ground, because that is what $12,000 an hour buys you. Lawyers who fight even when the cause is lost, who argue even when the argument is hollow, who bill every hour of a battle that they know in their hearts they cannot win. The moment that changed everything came on the second day in the afternoon session when Terrence called his final witness. The courtroom was tired. The air was stale. The spectators had settled into the drowsy rhythm of legal proceedings, that strange blend of boredom and tension that characterizes trials. And then Terrence stood and said, "Your Honor, the petitioner calls Margaret Whitmore to the stand." A ripple went through the gallery. At the defense table, Richard's head turned sharply, a movement so sudden that his neck audibly cracked. His eyes found the back of the courtroom, where a woman was standing, a woman in her late 40s with silver-streaked auburn hair and Richard's same sharp features, softened slightly by time and by something else, something that Richard's features did not have, which was kindness. Margaret Whitmore, Richard's sister, the third Whitmore sibling, the one who had stayed silent for 20 years, the one who had watched her family tear itself apart and had said nothing, done nothing, because the Whitmore way was silence, compliance, loyalty to the brand, and Margaret had been raised in that tradition as surely as Richard had. But Margaret was done with silence. She walked to the witness stand. She sat down. She was sworn in. And then Terrence asked her, in a quiet voice, "Miss Whitmore, did you know that your brother David had a son?" Margaret looked at Richard. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that look was 20 years of history, 20 years of dinners where David's chair sat empty, 20 years of holidays where his name was not mentioned, 20 years of a family pretending that one of its own had never existed. Richard's eyes were hard. Margaret's were wet. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Yes," she said, "I knew." The courtroom went still. Not the comfortable silence of before, a deeper silence. The silence of a room that has just heard something it cannot unhear. "I knew because David told me," Margaret continued. "He called me when the baby was born. He called me because he wanted at least one person in the family to know. He sent me a photograph." Her voice wavered. She paused. She took a breath. She continued, "I kept that photograph in my jewelry box for 8 years. I looked at it every night, and I said nothing. I said nothing because I was afraid. Afraid of Richard. Afraid of Mother. Afraid of losing my place in the family. I was a coward, and I have carried that shame every single day since David died." The gallery murmured. A woman in the front row was crying. Judge Okafor's expression did not change, but her eyes, sharp and attentive, moved from Margaret to Richard and stayed there. Terrence waited for the murmur to fade. Then he asked, "Ms. Whitmore, do you believe that your brother David was deliberately cut off from the family trust to prevent him and his descendants from inheriting?" "I don't believe it," Margaret said, and now her voice was not wavering, but ringing, clear and bright as a bell. "I know it, because Richard told me himself. He sat in our mother's kitchen and he said, 'David made his choice. He will never see a dime, and neither will any child he has with that woman.' Those were his exact words. I have never forgotten them." The courtroom erupted, not with sound, but with energy, a collective inhale, a shift in the room as if every person had leaned forward at the same moment. At the defense table, Richard's face had gone white. Not pale, white. The color of a man who has just watched the last wall of his fortress crumble and realized that there is nothing behind it, nothing to protect him, nothing to hide behind. His lawyers were whispering urgently to each other, their pens moving furiously across legal pads. But there was a frantic quality to their movements, the quality of people who know they are rearranging furniture on a sinking ship. Knox stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is hearsay." Judge Okafor looked at Knox over the rim of her glasses. "Mr. Knox, the statement was made by the defendant to the witness, his own sister, about his own intentions regarding the family trust. It is a statement of a party opponent and is not hearsay. The objection is overruled. Sit down." Knox sat down. The color in his face matched Richard's. And Terrence, standing before the witness box, allowed himself one small private moment of satisfaction, a breath held and released before he continued. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "one final question. Why are you here today?" Margaret looked at her brother one more time. Richard did not meet her eyes. He was staring at the table, his hands flat on the surface, his fingers splayed, as if he were trying to hold himself steady against a force that was pulling him under. Margaret looked at him, and what she felt was not triumph, but grief, a deep and aching grief for the brother she had lost, and the brother she had let become a monster, and the family that had chosen money over love, and paid for it with everything that mattered. "I am here," Margaret said, "because David would have been here if he could. And because that boy, that little boy selling water on the street corner, that boy who got hit in the face by a man who should have loved him, that boy is my nephew. He is my blood. And he deserves to know that not every Whitmore chose money over family. At least one of us chose him." The room was silent. Completely, totally silent. The kind of silence where you can hear a heartbeat. The kind of silence where you can hear a story reaching its turning point. The pivot on which everything swings. The moment where the old world ends and the new world begins. And in that silence, Ruth Carter, sitting at the plaintiff's table with her hands folded and her blind eyes pointed straight ahead, allowed a single tear to slide down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She let it fall. And it landed on the table with a sound that no one heard, but that meant everything. Judge Okafor called a recess, 30 minutes. The courtroom emptied slowly, like water draining from a tub, people filing out in murmuring clusters, their voices low and charged. Richard remained at the defense table. His lawyers surrounded him, a huddle of dark suits and low voices, but Richard was not listening to them. He was staring at the table. He was staring at nothing. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere 20 years in the past, in a kitchen where he had spoken those words to Margaret, those cold, precise, unforgivable words, and he was realizing, with the slow, sick certainty of a man watching a car crash in slow motion, that those words had followed him through 2 decades and had finally caught up. Knox leaned close to Richard's ear. "We need to settle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Today, now, before closing arguments. If we go to verdict, the judge will rule against us, and the amount will be larger, and the public humiliation will be complete. We need to offer a settlement." Richard turned his head slowly. His eyes met Knox's. They were the eyes of a man who was drowning and had stopped struggling. A man who had realized that the water was going to win. "How much?" Richard asked. "The full claim," Knox said. $153 million, plus damages for the assault, plus legal fees. We offer the full amount. We include a public apology, and we close this chapter." Richard closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw David. Not David as a man, David as a boy. 8 years old, on a bicycle, wobbling, finding his balance, turning back with that grin. "I did it, Richard. Did you see? I did it." Richard opened his eyes. "Do it," he said. "Offer whatever they want. Just end it." But Terrence Hayes did not accept the first offer. He did not accept it because he knew something that Richard's lawyers did not, which was that Ruth Carter did not want a quiet settlement. Ruth Carter wanted a public reckoning. She wanted the truth spoken aloud, in a courtroom, on the record, where it could never be denied or buried or shredded. And so Terrence went back to the defense table and said, very calmly, "My client will accept the financial terms, but she requires one additional condition. Mr. Whitmore must stand in this courtroom and acknowledge Elijah Carter as his nephew, as a member of the Whitmore family, and as a rightful heir to the Whitmore estate. He must say it publicly, on the record, in his own words. No script, no teleprompter, no rubber stamp." Knox turned to Richard. Richard stared at Terrence. The room, which had been buzzing with the low hum of settlement negotiations, went quiet again. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. And Richard Whitmore, for the first time in his life, had absolutely no idea what to do, because all the moves he knew, the money moves, the power moves, the lawyer moves, the silence moves, none of them worked anymore. The only move left was the one he had never learned. the truth. The recess ended. The courtroom refilled. Judge Okafor retook her seat. Knox stood and informed the court that the parties had reached a resolution, subject to one condition, and he asked for the court's indulgence. Judge Okafor nodded. And then Richard Whitmore stood up. He stood slowly, as if his body were resisting the instruction his brain was giving it. He straightened his jacket. He stepped out from behind the defense table. He walked to the center of the courtroom, to the spot where Terrence had stood, and he turned to face the room. Every eye was on him, every camera, every ear. The silence was absolute. He looked at Ruth Carter first. She was sitting at the plaintiff's table, her blind eyes pointed toward the sound of his footsteps, her hands still folded, her face calm and patient, the face of a woman who had waited a long time for this moment and was not going to rush it. Then Richard looked at the gallery, at the rows of faces, some angry, some curious, some tearful, all watching. And then he spoke. "My brother's name was David," he said. His voice was raw, unpolished, nothing like the smooth, controlled instrument he used in boardrooms and press conferences. This was the voice underneath, the one he had been hiding for 54 years. David Allen Whitmore. He was my younger brother, and 20 years ago, I threw him out of this family because he married a woman I disapproved of, a woman named Grace, a black woman. I told him he was dead to us. I cut him off from the trust. I sent him a letter with a stamped signature because I could not even bring myself to sign it by hand. And he left. And he married her. And they had a son. And then Grace died. And David died. And I never knew about the boy. I never knew because I never looked. I never looked because I did not want to know." He paused. He swallowed. The courtroom was so silent that the sound of his swallowing was audible, a dry click in his throat. "The boy's name is Elijah. He is 7 years old. He sells water on a street corner in Houston to help his blind grandmother pay rent. And 3 months ago, I threw a water bottle at his face because he tapped on my car window. I didn't know who he was. But it wouldn't have mattered if I did. What I did was wrong. Not because he was my nephew, because he was a child trying to survive. And I treated him like he was nothing." His voice cracked. He pressed his lips together. He took a breath, and when he continued, his eyes were red and his words were thick, and the mask, the one he had worn his entire life, was gone. "Elijah Carter is my nephew. He is the son of David Whitmore. He is a member of this family, and he is entitled to every penny the trust provides, not because a court says so, but because my father's legacy was meant for all of his descendants. I failed my brother. I failed his wife. I failed their son, and I have to live with that. But I will not fail this boy again." He stopped. He stood there. The room was motionless. Then, from the gallery, a sound, a single clap, then another. Then a wave, building slowly, cresting, filling the courtroom with applause that Richard Whitmore did not deserve. But that was not entirely for him. It was for the boy, for Ruth, for David and Grace, for the truth, finally spoken, finally free, finally echoing off the walls of a courtroom in Houston, Texas, where a family's longest secret had been dragged into the light and held up for the world to see. Judge Okafor did not stop the applause. She let it run its course. When it faded, she looked at Richard, and her expression was not warm, but it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman who had seen many people stand in courtrooms and say many things, and who could tell the difference between a performance and a confession. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "the court accepts the terms of the settlement. Let the record reflect that Elijah David Carter is recognized as a direct descendant of William Reginald Whitmore and is entitled to his lawful share of the Whitmore Family Trust, to be administered by a court-appointed trustee until the child reaches the age of majority. The separate civil claims are resolved as agreed. This matter is concluded." The gavel fell. The sound was sharp and final, like a door slamming shut on 20 years of lies. And in that sound was something that Elijah, sitting down the hall in a conference room with his coloring book and his animal crackers, could not hear but could somehow feel. A vibration in the air, a shift in the universe, the moment when the scales tipped and the world, for once, for one bright and shining moment, was fair. Ruth stood from the table. Terrence took her arm and guided her toward the door. The crowd parted for her the way crowds part for people who have earned their passage, with respect, with reverence, with the understanding that they were in the presence of something larger than themselves. Ruth walked through the courtroom with her head high and her step sure, and when she reached the hallway, she heard a sound that made her stop. A small, familiar voice, coming from the conference room, calling, "Grandma!" Elijah ran to her. He hit her at waist height, his arms wrapping around her, his face pressing into her stomach, and she bent down and held him and breathed him in. Coconut shampoo and animal crackers, and the irreplaceable, unmistakable smell of her grandson. Her reason, her world. "How did it go?" he asked, looking up at her, his eyes wide with the anxious hope of a child who does not understand what is happening, but trusts the adults around him to make it right. Ruth smiled. That slow, full smile, the one that crinkled the skin around her useless eyes, the one that showed the gap where her left canine used to be. "Baby," she said, "we are going to be okay." And this time, when she said it, it was not a prayer. It was a fact. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April, Ruth Carter sat in the kitchen of a house she owned. Not an apartment, a house. A small, clean, 3-bedroom house on a quiet street in 3rd Ward, not far from where Grace had gone to nursing school. Not far from where David had painted a bedroom yellow for a baby not yet born. The house was not a mansion. Ruth had not wanted a mansion. She had wanted a home, and that is what she got. A place with a yard where Elijah could play. A kitchen where the faucet did not drip. Bedrooms where the ceiling did not leak. And a front porch where she could sit in the evenings and listen to the neighborhood. The children playing, the dogs barking, the ice cream truck making its slow musical rounds. The trust fund was established. $153 million, managed by a court-appointed trustee, invested conservatively, growing quietly, waiting for Elijah to grow up. Ruth had access to a modest monthly allowance for the boy's needs, for school, for food, for clothes, for the small pleasures of childhood. But the bulk of the money sat untouched, a promise for the future, a foundation on which Elijah could build whatever life he chose. Ruth did not spend lavishly. She bought the house. She paid off her medical bills. She hired a woman named Angela to help with cooking and cleaning 3 days a week, not because she was lazy, but because her body was tired and she wanted her remaining energy for the boy, for the evenings at the kitchen table where she helped him with homework, her fingers reading his textbook in Braille, for the mornings in the yard where she listened to him practice soccer with the neighborhood kids, for the quiet moments that are the real treasure of life, the moments that money can buy only when it buys time. Elijah still went to public school. Ruth insisted. He still wore regular clothes, played regular games, ate regular food. He did not know the exact amount of the trust. He knew only that his father had a brother, and that brother had done something wrong, and a judge had made it right. That was enough. The rest would come later, when he was older, when he could understand the full story, the beautiful and terrible story of how he came to be who he was. Richard Whitmore resigned as CEO of Whitmore Capital Partners. The board politely but firmly asked him to step down, and he did not fight it, because there was no fight left in him. He moved out of the River Oaks mansion. Diane, who had served the divorce papers the same week as the court ruling, kept the house. Richard moved to a smaller place, a condominium in Montrose, and he lived there quietly, out of the public eye, a man whose fortune had shrunk by 1/3 and whose reputation had shrunk by considerably more. He did not give interviews. He did not make statements. He existed in the specific silence of a man who has been publicly stripped of the story he told about himself and has not yet found a new one to replace it. But one thing he did do, one thing that no one expected and that only 2 people ever knew about. On a Thursday afternoon in March, 5 months after the court ruling, Richard Whitmore drove to the post office and mailed a letter. It was addressed to Elijah Carter, care of Ruth Carter, at their new address in 3rd Ward. The letter was short, it was handwritten, and it said this: "Elijah, I am your Uncle Richard. I did a terrible thing to you, and I did terrible things to your father before you were born. I cannot undo any of it, but I want you to know that your father was the best of us. He was braver than me. He was kinder than me. He loved harder than me. And if you grow up to be anything like him, the world will be lucky to have you. I am sorry. I am sorry for everything." The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Ruth held it in her hands. She asked Angela to read it aloud, and when Angela finished reading, Ruth sat quietly for a long time, the letter resting on the kitchen table next to a cup of coffee. The new kitchen table in the new house with the faucet that did not drip and the ceiling that did not leak. She did not know what to feel. She did not know if she could forgive Richard Whitmore. She did not know if forgiveness was hers to give or if it belonged to David and Grace, who were beyond giving anything. But she knew one thing. She knew that the letter was real, that the words were real, that somewhere inside the man who had thrown a water bottle at a child and shredded a brother's photograph and signed a letter with a rubber stamp, there was a small and wounded thing that might, with time and suffering, grow into something resembling a human being. She folded the letter. She placed it in a drawer. She would give it to Elijah when he was older, when he was ready, when he could read it and understand it and decide for himself what it meant and what to do with it. Because that was Elijah's right, the right to choose, the right to forgive or not, the right to be angry or not, the right to reach out or not. Ruth would not make that choice for him. She would give him the truth, all of it, and let him carry it the way he carried everything, with those serious eyes and that steady voice and that stubborn, luminous courage that he had inherited from his mother and his father and his grandmother. The three people who had loved him most in this world, two of them from heaven and one of them from the kitchen table. On a warm April evening, Ruth sat on the front porch of the new house with Elijah beside her. The sun was going down. The sky was turning that particular shade of orange and pink that Houston skies turn in the spring, a color so vivid it seemed painted. Elijah was eating an orange popsicle that was melting faster than he could eat it, dripping orange rivers down his wrist. Ruth was holding a cup of coffee, not from the Maxwell House can, from a real coffee maker, the kind that grinds the beans fresh and fills the house with a smell that is warm and dark and full of promise. "Grandma," Elijah said, through a mouthful of popsicle. "Yes, baby? Do you ever miss the old apartment?" Ruth thought about it. She thought about the faucet and the ceiling and the coffee can and the stairs that creaked and the refrigerator that hummed and the table where she had counted coins and prayed prayers and held a crying boy and plotted a revolution. She thought about it and she smiled. "I miss the memories," she said, "but the memories came with us. They're right here." Elijah nodded. He took another bite of popsicle. Then he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "I think my daddy would like this house." Ruth's hand tightened around her coffee cup. She took a slow, deep breath. The evening air was warm and carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and somebody's barbecue and the jasmine bush that grew along the fence. She let the breath out. She let the tightness go. And she said, in a voice that was steady and sure and full of everything she had ever learned about love and loss and the stubborn miracle of survival, "He does like it, baby. He likes it very much." The coffee in her cup was still warm, and for the first time in a long while, it did not taste bitter. Thank you for finishing the story with me. If you enjoyed it, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.